Good morning, Alex and friends. I'm Grace. Today is Thursday, January 15th, 2026, and you're listening to Alex's News. The high in Riverside today will reach 78.6 degrees, with a low of 57.0, so expect a mild day with plenty of sunshine. Coming up, we'll examine the reasons behind the FBI's raid on a Washington Post reporter's home as part of an investigation into leaks during the Trump era, and explore the Trump administration's abrupt decision to reverse $2 billion in overnight cuts to mental health programs. We'll also cover other key stories making headlines today. All this and more coming up on Alex's News. Stay tuned. We start this half hour with an extraordinary raid on a Washington Post reporter's home. Ethan, what do we know about what happened to Hannah Nathanson yesterday?
Federal agents showed up unannounced at dawn yesterday, January 14th, at her home in Alexandria, Virginia, according to detailed accounts in the Washington Post. They spent several hours searching the house and left with her personal phone, 2 laptops including her post machine, and even a Garmin smartwatch. Agents told her on the spot that she was not the target of their criminal probe, but that they needed her devices as evidence in an ongoing leak investigation.
How out of the ordinary is it for the FBI to search a reporter's home like that?
Reporters and lawyers are calling it highly unusual and aggressive. That phrase comes straight from Associated Press reporting carried by ABC News. The Post's executive editor, Matt Murray, said in a public statement the search was, quote, extraordinary and deeply concerning, end quote, and raised profound questions about First Amendment protections. BBC News, which also covered the raid, stressed how rare it is in the United States to see law enforcement physically enter a journalist's home, warning it could deter critical reporting.
For listeners who may not know her work, who is Hannah Nathanson and what does she cover?
She has become one of the Washington Post's key reporters on the federal workforce under the second Trump administration, digging into layoffs, agency overhauls, and what critics call efforts to purge the so-called deep state. In a first-person piece last month, she described building a network of about 1,169 sources, mostly current and former federal workers, using the encrypted app Signal. She wrote about keeping no written notes on sources, using encrypted drives and private browsers, really going to great lengths to protect people talking to her. NPR, in its coverage today, emphasized how her reporting has exposed the administration's zero-tolerance stance toward internal dissent.
So how does an investigative beat on federal workers connect to this Pentagon contractor now facing Espionage Act charges?
The raid grows out of an Espionage Act case against a 63-year-old Navy veteran and systems engineer named Aurelio Perez Lugones, who has worked on Pentagon contracts for decades. According to court filings summarized by CBS News and The Guardian, the FBI searched his home in Laurel, Maryland, last week after arresting him on January 8th. Agents say they found documents marked secret tucked into a lunchbox, in his basement, and in his car, including intelligence reports about Venezuela called Country One in the filings, and materials tied to a recent military operation named Operation Absolute Resolve.
What do prosecutors say he actually did with those documents?
The government alleges he improperly accessed, printed, and removed sensitive material from secure systems, took screenshots, and even scribbled notes on a yellow pad, all without authorization. That is why he is charged with unlawful retention of national defense information under the Espionage Act, which carries up to 10 years in prison on that count. Importantly, the public filings so far focus only on possession, not on any proven handoff of documents to outsiders.
If the public paperwork doesn't show him leaking, why did agents seize Nathanson's devices?
This is where anonymous Justice Department sources come in. CBS News and Yahoo News report that officials claim Perez Lugones was in active contact with Nathanson on Signal around the time of his arrest, and that some chat logs contained what they call classified military information. The largely sealed search warrant for her home, according to descriptions in The Guardian, argues that her devices are needed to trace the digital trail of those alleged communications and to show whether she was obtaining and reporting leaked material. Yet even as they took her electronics, agents reportedly stressed she was a witness, not a target, at least for now.
Where does his case stand as of today, and how is that feeding into the pressure on Nathanson?
This morning in Baltimore, he appeared for a detention hearing to decide whether he stays locked up while the case moves forward. A magistrate judge initially allowed a conditional release, but Attorney General Pam Bondi's team appealed and persuaded a higher court to keep him in custody, arguing the materials he held posed a significant national security risk. In a statement covered by CBS News, Bondi said the information endangered warfighters, and FBI Director Kash Patel echoed that on social media, calling it a grave threat, according to Yahoo News. The hearing itself has not taken up Nathanson's role, but the Washington Post reports prosecutors have subpoenaed the paper for any staff communications with Perez Lugones, which widens the lens on the newsroom.
You mentioned Attorney General Bondi. This raid is really the first big test of a policy change she made last year, right?
That is right, and it is crucial context. In late April of last year, Bondi formally rescinded what was known as the Garland Memo, a Biden-era policy that had largely barred the Justice Department from seizing journalists' phone records or devices in leak cases unless the reporter was personally suspected of a crime. According to analysis by the Reporters Committee for Freedom of the Press and Lawfare, she replaced that ban with a looser last resort standard that allows searches after investigators say they have exhausted other options. Critics argue the Nathanson raid looks like the opposite of last resort, coming just days after Perez Lugones was arrested.
Under those older Garland rules, would this kind of search of a reporter's home have been allowed?
Legal experts interviewed by RCFP say it would have been very hard to justify. The old standard, later codified in federal regulations, required multiple layers of approval and a strong showing that the journalist was likely engaged in criminal conduct, not just doing news gathering. Here, agents explicitly told Nathanson she was not a target, which makes the aggressive seizure of her work tools look like exactly the scenario those rules were meant to prevent.
What reasons has Bondi given for tearing up those protections for the press?
In her April directive, which outlets like Forbes and Salon covered, Bondi described leakers as engaging in, quote, treasonous acts, end quote, that undermine President Trump's agenda. Her language tracks closely with Project 2025, a conservative blueprint that calls for an assertive Justice Department willing to crack down on unauthorized disclosures and weaponized civil servants. According to Neiman Lab and NextGov, the goal is to remake the bureaucracy and stamp out what allies see as sabotage from within.
And where does the Pentagon, now the so-called Department of War, fit into this raid?
The Guardian reports that the search warrant on Nathanson's home was requested at the urging of the newly renamed Department of War, reflecting how national security agencies have embraced the tougher leak stance. That rename happened by executive order last September, symbolically reframing the military's mission. The department has been under intense scrutiny for operations like the one in Venezuela and for other disputed overseas moves, including renewed talk about Greenland, as BBC News has noted. From their perspective, any leak related to those operations is not just embarrassing but dangerous.
FBI Director Kash Patel has been unusually vocal. What is he saying about Nathanson's reporting specifically?
In interviews highlighted by CBS News, Patel has suggested that some of Nathanson's stories themselves endangered national security, though he has not publicly pointed to any single article that revealed operational secrets. On social media, he has talked about, quote, politicized leakers and their media enablers, end quote, language that lumps journalists together with the sources they cover. Bondi reinforced that tone on X, formerly Twitter, saying the administration, quote, will not tolerate illegal leaks of classified information that pose a grave risk to our nation's security, end quote, according to ABC News and Al Jazeera. But none of that rhetoric has yet been matched by specific allegations that Nathanson broke the law.
Let's dig into that gap. What do the actual public court documents say, and what do they leave out?
The unsealed FBI affidavit in Perez Lugones' case, reviewed by outlets like GPB News and Freedom Forum, lays out in detail how agents say he mishandled and stored classified files, but it does not name Nathanson or any journalist. Her search warrant remains mostly under seal, with only the inventory of seized devices visible, as Yahoo and local station WCBI have reported. That means the strongest claims against her are coming from anonymous officials, not from sworn statements in open court. It is a key reason many lawyers are urging caution before accepting the government's narrative.
Have legal experts weighed in on whether this looks like a crime by the reporter or just normal news gathering?
Groups like the ACLU of D.C., quoted in The Guardian, say that based on what is public, there is no clear evidence Natanson knowingly solicited or published classified information in a way that would cross legal lines. They point out that national security reporting often involves talking with people who hold clearances, and that is protected activity unless the reporter actively joins the unlawful scheme. The fact agents called her a witness, not a target, underscores that difference. Press advocates such as the Committee to Protect Journalists and Reporters Without Borders warn this kind of raid blurs that line and creates an intense, chilling effect.
How does this moment fit into the longer history of prior restraint and press freedom fights in this country?
Many lawyers are looking back to the Pentagon Papers case, New York Times Company versus United States, where the Supreme Court made it extremely difficult for the government to block publication in advance. Instead, the modern tactic has been to go after leakers after the fact, and sometimes to pressure journalists indirectly through subpoenas and phone records. The Reporters Committee and Cornell law scholars argue that physically seizing a reporter's devices in a leak case inches closer to prior restraint, because it can halt or delay ongoing reporting by cutting off access to sources and notes.
What has the Washington Post itself said about the raid and what it means for their newsroom?
The Post has publicly condemned it as an intimidation tactic that strikes at the heart of its work covering the federal government. Executive editor Matt Murray said it raises, quote, profound questions around the constitutional protections for journalists, end quote, and vowed to fight for Natanson's rights and their sources, confidentiality. Their editorial board has framed the episode as a direct test of their motto, democracy dies in darkness, a phrase The Guardian and Al Jazeera both picked up in their coverage.
Beyond one newspaper, what kind of reaction are we seeing from press groups and on Capitol Hill?
Press freedom organizations are treating this as a five-alarm fire. The Committee to Protect Journalists and the Reporters Committee have both called it a tremendous escalation, noting that raiding a reporter's home is far more invasive than serving a subpoena, and something they say is virtually unheard of in modern times. On Capitol Hill, Senate Democrats, including Dick Durbin and Alex Padilla, have introduced resolutions urging the administration to honor core First Amendment principles, according to AP and Tech Policy Press. In the House, Representative Hank Johnson is again pushing the Press Act, which would turn those old Garland-era protections into federal law, as legal memos from Troutman Pepper explain.
Realistically, does Congress have tools to stop future raids like this, or are courts the main check?
Congress can absolutely shape the ground rules through shield laws and by tightening statutes like the Privacy Protection Act of 1980. But as Lawfare has pointed out, a Supreme Court decision last November that limited broad nationwide injunctions means one judge is less likely to freeze Bondi's entire policy across the country. Instead, you may see a patchwork of challenges in different courts as cases like Natanson's move forward. That uncertainty alone can make newsrooms more cautious.
Remind us what the Privacy Protection Act does, and why some experts think it may have been violated here.
The Privacy Protection Act generally bars law enforcement from searching or seizing a journalist's work materials, including notes and outtakes, unless there is probable cause that the journalists themselves committed a crime, not just their source. Several scholars quoted by RCFP and the ACLU of D.C. say that if Natanson truly is only a witness, as agents told her, then barging into her home and grabbing her devices could run afoul of that law. The Justice Department may argue that encrypted digital records present unique challenges that justify exceptions, but that is exactly the kind of question courts will need to sort out.
How are other newsrooms reacting behind the scenes? Are they changing how they protect sources because of this?
According to Neiman Lab and Reporters Without Borders, security trainings in newsrooms have taken on new urgency in just the last day. Journalists are being urged to disable facial recognition and fingerprint unlocks, to rely more on strong passcodes, and to keep the most sensitive conversations off their primary phones altogether. Some investigative reporters are already telling sources to assume that any digital device could be seized and forensically searched, pushing more communication back to in-person meetings, or old-fashioned unlogged calls.
That goes straight to Nathanson's beat. What does this raid mean for the more than 1,000 federal workers she has cultivated as sources?
Her December piece described that network of 1,169 contacts on Signal, many of them current employees worried about retaliation for speaking out. Even if the messages themselves are encrypted, the fact that her phone and laptops are now in FBI hands is deeply unnerving for those people. Metadata about who talked to her and when, or notes recovered from devices, can help agents map her entire sourcing web. Advocates fear many potential whistleblowers will simply stop reaching out.
Do we know how much access investigators can really get if those Signal messages were protected?
In theory, Signal's end-to-end encryption means the company itself cannot read message content, and it collects almost no metadata. But if a device is unlocked when seized, or if forensic tools can bypass its protections, agents may be able to see conversations stored on that phone or laptop, even without reading the actual texts. Just seeing a pattern of repeated contact with someone who holds a clearance could be enough to bring that person under scrutiny.
How does this compare with leak crackdowns during the first Trump term or even under President Obama?
The Obama administration brought more leak prosecutions under the Espionage Act than all previous presidents combined, but it typically relied on subpoenas and phone records, not home raids on reporters. During Trump's first term, rhetoric against the press was fierce, but under Attorney General Merrick Garland in the Biden years, the Justice Department swung back toward robust protections for journalists. This second Trump administration has reversed course again, with Bondi's memo and Patel's public stance signaling that the government is now willing to use its most muscular tools, including invasive searches, in national security leak cases.
You mentioned Operation Absolute Resolve in Venezuela. Why is that operation and those documents seen as so sensitive?
The operation reportedly took place on January 3rd and resulted in the capture of Venezuelan leader Nicolas Maduro, something neither the Pentagon nor the White House has fully detailed publicly. Documents about that mission would likely include intelligence sources, surveillance capabilities, and contingency plans if things went wrong. As The Guardian and BBC have noted, any leak could ripple across Latin America, endanger informants, and complicate already tense relations with countries that see this as an overreach by Washington. That is the backdrop for the administration's argument that nothing tied to that mission can safely leak.
Internationally, are other governments and press watchers paying attention to this raid on an American reporter?
Very much so. BBC, The Guardian, and Al Jazeera have all framed the story as a warning sign about democratic backsliding and press freedom in the United States. Groups that track global rankings, like Reporters Without Borders, often cite these episodes when they reassess how free journalists really are in a given country. Authoritarian governments, meanwhile, sometimes point to American crackdowns to justify their own, saying, in effect, even Washington does this.
Let's bring it back to the people involved. What happens next for Hannah Nathanson herself?
For now, she is back at home but without some of her core tools, and her lawyers are expected to ask a judge to review or limit how investigators search those devices. According to the Post reporting, they may seek a special master or filter team to screen out privileged or irrelevant journalistic material. Any move by prosecutors to reclassify her from witness to subject or even target would be a major escalation and would likely trigger an all-out legal fight over press protections.
And for Aurelio Perez Lugones, what are the key milestones coming up in his case?
The next step is likely a formal indictment by a grand jury that could either stick with the single unlawful retention charge or add counts if prosecutors think they can prove more. His continued detention suggests the Justice Department sees him as both a flight risk and a national security threat, a point Bondi has emphasized. If the case eventually goes to trial, it could become a test of how far the government is willing to push the Espionage Act in matters that brush up against journalism.
For people listening who just scroll the news on their phones, why should they care about this fight over leaks and warrants?
It goes directly to how much they will ever learn about what their government is doing in their name. Stories about mass federal layoffs, controversial foreign operations, or internal resistance inside agencies almost always rely on people who take the risk of talking to reporters. If those sources and those reporters have to worry that a knock at the door could cost them their freedom, many of those stories will never be told. That leaves the public in the dark at the very moment when decisions are being made that affect their lives.
Looking ahead, what are you watching most closely over the next few days?
Two things stand out. First, whether any new filings in Baltimore hint that prosecutors are trying to connect Perez-Lugones' conduct more directly to Nathanson's reporting. Second, whether the Justice Department quietly narrows its search of her devices under pressure or doubles down and uses this case as a template for future leak probes. Either way, how this plays out will shape the rules of engagement between national security officials and the press for years to come.
A complicated, high-stakes story, and we will keep following it. Ethan, thanks for walking us through it this morning. Our next story centers on a huge whiplash in health policy that unfolded in just 24 hours. Reporter Chloe is with us. Chloe, what did the Trump administration do that set off such a firestorm?
Earlier this week, on Tuesday night, January 13th, health officials quietly moved to cancel almost $2 billion in federal grants for mental health and addiction services. According to NPR, more than 2,700 grants run through the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administration, or SAMHSA, got termination letters overnight. These were programs that help people with opioid addiction, suicide prevention, and kids' mental health, and they were told their funding was basically gone immediately. It all happened with no warning to Congress and no individual explanation to grantees.
That is a staggering amount of money to suddenly yank. What kinds of programs were about to lose their funding?
It was almost the entire discretionary grant portfolio at SAMHSA, built up over roughly a decade. The Washington Post and CBS News describe core overdose prevention work being hit, like programs that distribute naloxone, the overdose reversal drug, and fentanyl testing strips so people can see what they are using. Traditional treatment efforts got swept up too, including a national opioid response training network and community recovery projects that rely on peer support specialists. Even children's mental health and school-based suicide prevention programs, some tied to the 988 crisis hotline, found out they were suddenly on the chopping block.
So this wasn't just harm reduction programs being targeted. It sounds much broader. How does this tie in to the administration's larger health agenda?
The cuts were very much in line with the administration's Make America Healthy Again push, known as MAHA. Health and Human Services Secretary Robert F. Kennedy Jr. has been reshaping HHS to emphasize what he calls wellness and abstinence, and to move away from strategies viewed as supporting drug use, like needle exchanges. NPR and The Guardian both note that many harm reduction efforts had already been labeled in Trump executive orders as, quote, facilitating illegal drug use, end quote. The grant cancellations were also influenced by a newer player in Washington, the Department of Government Efficiency, or DOGE, which has a mandate to slash federal spending fast.
Remind us what DOGE is, because that's not a traditional cabinet department. How did it get involved in mental health grants?
DOGE is essentially a rebranded and turbocharged version of the old U.S. Digital Service, created by executive order on Inauguration Day last year. According to CBS News and local reporting from Action Newsjax, it is led by tech and business figures like Elon Musk and Vivek Ramaswamy, with a goal of cutting about $2 trillion in federal spending by July 4th of this year. DOGE embeds what it calls DOGE teams inside agencies, where they push for big, fast reductions in staff and programs. In this case, DOGE's blueprint and the planned replacement of SAMHSA with a new Administration for a Healthy America helped drive the decision to wipe out those grants.
Who actually pulled the trigger on those termination letters at SAMHSA?
The paperwork trail points to Christopher Carroll, SAMHSA's principal deputy assistant secretary. He signed form letters that went out to roughly 2,700 to 2,800 groups, according to documents reviewed by NPR and The Washington Post. Those letters used almost identical language, saying the programs no longer, quote, effectuate, end quote, the agency's priorities or the administration's public health agenda. What is striking, legal experts told outlets like Just Security, is that the letters did not cite any specific performance problems, fraud, or misconduct by the grantees.
How did the people running these programs react when those letters landed?
Many were stunned and immediately panicked. Some organizations had already tried to scrub words like harm reduction and equity from their materials to stay in line with the new administration, but still lost funding. Catherine Cates-Wessel, who heads the American Academy of Addiction Psychiatry, told Roll Call her group leads 2 major national SAMHSA grants and had bent over backward to comply with Trump policies, only to face overnight million-dollar holes in their budgets. Advocacy groups described Wednesday morning, January 14th, as a day of chaos as clinics scrambled to figure out whether they needed to lay off staff or close doors.
How quickly did word of this reach Capitol Hill? And what was the political reaction?
It reached Congress almost immediately because many of these programs sit in lawmakers' own districts. NPR reports that by mid-morning Wednesday, offices from both parties were fielding frantic calls from health providers. Democrats like Senator Tammy Baldwin, the top Democrat on the Senate panel that writes the HHS budget, blasted the cuts as, quote, heartless, end quote. But what really forced the issue was that Republicans from hard-hit opioid states also erupted, saying this move directly undercut the administration's promises to tackle fentanyl and addiction.
What were some of the specific concerns from those Republican lawmakers?
Several Republicans warned that yanking this money would mean more overdose deaths, more homelessness, and heavier burdens on already stretched police and emergency rooms. Roughly 100 House members from both parties signed a letter demanding an immediate briefing from Secretary Kennedy, according to the Washington Post. Governors and attorneys general, especially in states battered by fentanyl, also started to weigh in, seeing it as Washington turning its back on their communities. That bipartisan pushback made it clear this was not just a partisan food fight. It threatened members, constituents across the map, including conservative areas.
You mentioned earlier that legal issues also played a role. Were these grant cancellations actually on shaky legal ground?
Very much so. Under the Impoundment Control Act of 1974, a president is not supposed to withhold or cancel congressionally approved money simply because he dislikes the policy, without going through a formal process with Congress. The Government Accountability Office had already ruled last summer that similar Trump freezes on NIH and Head Start dollars were unlawful impoundments, as Just Security and legal firms like Holland and Knight pointed out. On top of that, the specific grant awards for 2026 did not contain clear clauses allowing terminations just for so-called ideological misalignment, which made these cancellations vulnerable to being struck down in court as arbitrary.
Were any lawsuits actually filed? Or were they just being threatened?
They were moving very quickly toward court. The American Foundation for Suicide Prevention and other groups were preparing to seek temporary restraining orders, essentially emergency court orders, to keep the money flowing. Advocates were pointing to a June 2025 federal ruling, where Judge William Young threw out ideological cancellations at the NIH, and another case this month involving education grants, saying you cannot simply turn off funding based on politics or geography. According to CBS News, HHS lawyers warned internally that they were almost certain to lose similar cases over these SAMHSA cuts.
So you have bipartisan anger and strong legal risk. How did the reversal actually come about?
By Wednesday afternoon and evening, the White House started to grasp how big this had become. Roll Call reports that senior aides convened high-level meetings, and there was what one official described as a White House intervention to unwind the decision. Secretary Kennedy ultimately authorized a full reversal Wednesday night, recognizing, in the words of one CBS News source, that the backlash was catastrophic and could derail his broader MAHA restructuring plans. A senior official tried to downplay it, telling reporters this would be, quote, a one-day issue, end quote, but they were clearly retreating under heavy fire.
Once that about face was ordered, what happened on the ground for those grantees?
HHS began sending out restoration letters, essentially nullifying the earlier terminations. By today, Thursday, January 15th, many organizations have emails or official notices saying their awards remain in force and the nearly $2 billion is being fully restored. For now, that means programs can keep paying staff, buying medication, and running support groups without interruption. But leaders like Hannah Wesolowski at the National Alliance on Mental Illness told NPR their confidence in the stability of federal funding has been badly shaken.
It sounds like even though the money is back, the trust is not. What kinds of oversight steps are starting now in response?
Several investigations and proposed fixes are already in motion. The GAO has opened an inquiry into who exactly authorized the cancellations and how much influence DOGE and the planned new Administration for a Healthy America had, according to coverage in AJMC and Becker's Behavioral Health. House Appropriations Democrats, led by Representative Rosa DeLauro, have demanded all emails and communications about the grant decisions from the start of January through yesterday. Lawmakers are also floating new bills, like a Grant Security and Transparency Act, that would require at least 60 days' notice and specific cause before grants can be pulled midstream.
Are there proposals to change the balance of power between Congress and the executive branch on this?
That is very much part of the discussion. Senator Patty Murray and others are talking about strengthening GAO's ability to go to court when administrations ignore spending laws. There's also interest in writing into law that full-year funding bills for health agencies cannot be unilaterally undercut through reorganizations like replacing SAMHSA, unless Congress agrees. The broader goal is to prevent any White House of either party from using backdoor administrative moves to effectively cancel programs that Congress has chosen to fund.
We keep coming back to this tension between Trump's stated concern about the opioid crisis and these cuts. How are observers making sense of that contradiction?
A lot of analysts see a real clash between President Trump's political messaging and the ideological direction of MAHA and DOGE. On one hand, he just reauthorized a major bipartisan opioid law, the SUPPORT Act, in December, signaling commitment to combating addiction. On the other hand, the MAHA framework, as described by NPR and others, is deeply skeptical of harm reduction and even some mainstream public health approaches, favoring abstinence-only models. When you pair that with an aggressive cost-cutting machine like DOGE, you get decisions that undercut the very services needed to keep overdose deaths from rising.
Do we know yet who inside the administration ultimately pushed for the cuts? Was it Secretary Kennedy, DOGE, or someone else?
That is one of the biggest unanswered questions. The formal signature on the letters belongs to Christopher Carroll, but people familiar with the process told reporters there was pressure coming from DOGE teams, from planners building the new health agency, and possibly from political staff in Kennedy's orbit. Some sources suggest Kennedy misjudged how far he could go in quickly realigning grants with his wellness and abstinence vision. The ongoing GAO review and congressional document requests may eventually map out that chain of command.
What are public health experts saying about the damage this episode might still cause, even though the grants were restored?
They worry about both immediate and long-term harm. In the short term, even a day or two of uncertainty can cause staff to start job hunting, local governments to pause contracts, and patients to fear losing services. Longer term, leaders told Spokane Public Radio and other outlets that they now have to build contingency plans in case something like this happens again, which pulls time and energy away from actual care. It also makes some state and local partners more hesitant to rely on federal dollars, especially for politically sensitive work like harm reduction.
Is there any upside people are pointing to, or is it all downside?
The one silver lining advocates see is that the backlash showed how strong bipartisan support has become for mental health and addiction treatment. Groups like NAMI say this episode reminded lawmakers that these grants are not abstract line items, they are lifelines in their home districts. It also forced a very public conversation about the legal limits on executive power over already appropriated money. but they are clear that they would rather not have gone through 24 hours of chaos to prove that point.
Before we wrap up, what should listeners watch for in the coming days and weeks?
I would watch 3 things. First, whether GAO or congressional investigators uncover direct involvement from DOJ or senior White House aides in ordering these cancellations. Second, whether any of the threatened lawsuits go forward anyway, to try to get court rulings that could block similar efforts in the future. And third, whether the administration tries a more targeted version of this later, perhaps focusing only on harm reduction grants, which would likely trigger another major fight.
A lot of moving pieces, and very real stakes for families dealing with addiction or mental illness right now. Reporter Chloe, thanks for walking us through it.
Thank you, Grace.
Here are some other headlines. In Washington, Arctic diplomacy is skating on thin ice. After a high-stakes White House meeting, the United States, Denmark, and Greenland agreed to form a high-level working group to tackle rising tensions over the island's sovereignty and security. Danish Foreign Minister Lars Løkke Rasmussen and Greenlandic Foreign Minister Vivian Motzfeldt met with Vice President J.D. Vance and Secretary of State Marco Rubio, exploring compromises even as President Trump keeps floating the idea of outright buying Greenland. Copenhagen has drawn clear red lines on territorial integrity, but U.S. pressure has already prompted Operation Arctic Endurance, with Denmark and NATO allies deploying troops and equipment to Nuuk. The new working group is expected to convene within weeks to seek an Arctic security framework before this cold conflict really heats up. In the Middle East, the peace process is trying to move from rockets to roadmaps. U.S. Special Envoy Steve Witkoff has announced Phase 2 of President Trump's 20-point plan to end the conflict in Gaza, shifting the spotlight to demilitarization and reconstruction. At its core, the National Committee for the Administration of Gaza, a 15-member technocratic body led by Ali Shaath, tasked with running daily governance and essential services. Egypt, Turkey, and Qatar have welcomed the move, but Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu dismissed it as largely symbolic, saying real progress hinges on the return of the remains of the final unaccounted-for hostage, Ron Gvili. Washington is still pushing for the full demilitarization of Gaza and the disarmament of Hamas, with talk of an eventual Israeli pullback to a buffer zone and a possible international Board of Peace stabilization force. But without a concrete disarmament mechanism, the plan risks being heavy on committees and light on commitments. In Uganda, ballot boxes are open but bandwidth is closed. Voting in the general election began today amid a nationwide internet and mobile phone shutdown and long delays at polling stations. Some sites in Kampala and Jinja opened up to 4 hours late due to missing ballot papers and malfunctioning biometric voter machines, turning democracy into a hurry-up-and-wait exercise. President Yoweri Museveni, 81, is seeking a 7th term against 7 challengers, led by musician-turned-politician Bobi Wine, who is calling time on 4 decades of Museveni's rule. Regulators say the blackout is to curb misinformation and fraud. Rights groups call it a brutal campaign of repression. With results due within 48 hours, glitches and gag orders could turn this vote into a test of both patience and peace. In the U.S., the nation's largest carrier learned the hard way that no bars means big scars. Verizon has restored its wireless network after a roughly 10-hour outage that began around 12:30 p.m. Eastern on January 14th, sending hundreds of thousands of phones into SOS mode and some 911 lines into limbo. Outage tracker reports peaked near 180,000, while estimates suggest as many as 2 million customers were affected. Verizon confirmed full restoration around 10:20 p.m., advising users to restart their devices and promising account credits. The Federal Communications Commission has launched an investigation. Verizon says there's no sign of a cyber attack, and experts point to a likely software configuration error or botched internal update. It's the biggest telecom stumble of 2026 so far, dialing up calls for stronger safeguards on critical communications. And in the chip world, the silicon ceiling just got shattered. Taiwan Semiconductor Manufacturing Company posted a record fourth-quarter net profit of 505.7 billion new Taiwan dollars, about $16.3 billion, up 35% year-on-year and beating forecasts. Fueled by seemingly insatiable demand for artificial intelligence chips, TSMC is raising its 2026 capital spending to between $52 and $56 billion, up sharply from $40.9 billion last year. Advanced process nodes of 7 nanometers and below now generate 77% of its wafer revenue, keeping TSMC at the core of the AI hardware boom for clients like NVIDIA, Apple, and AMD. The company is fast-tracking next-generation 2-nanometer technology and pouring concrete, not just cash, into new fabs in Arizona and fresh plants in Japan. As geopolitics and gigaflops collide, TSMC is making it clear. In the global tech race, the chips are very much up. That's all we have for now. Today's episode was made by Alexander King with GPT-5, Gemini Pro 3, Gemini Flash 3, and Google Cloud Text-to-Speech. I hope you have a great day. I'll see you tomorrow, Alex.